technical difficulties here. Hey everybody, Jeff Sorensen here. I'm the Forest Ranger with the Wisconsin DNR out of the Medford Ranger Station. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Good way to get a lot of information out to a few people on a night like this. Much rather do this in person, but with COVID and everything we've got going on right now in our world, this is, the best way we can do this. Before I forget, want to thank Bill Clace for setting this up tonight. He did all the background work for this, sent out mailings, the brochures, did all the organizing, did all the registration, and actually gave me these first two presentations that I was able to modify a little bit. But anyway, thanks so much to Bill. So tonight we're going to do a little bit about successful timber harvest here. A little bit of background for me. I'm actually been in the business for quite a while, graduated Madison in '88. Worked on the Menominee Indian Reservation as a forester, worked over in Michigan as a private lands forester there for Soil and Water Conservation District. And spent the bulk of my career actually as a consulting forester out of Wausau, starting in about '98. Just recently, a year and a half ago, joined the DNR and I've been working with them since. So got a pretty solid background in timber sales and that kind of thing. So hopefully I can share some insights and kind of give you the, tips to help you out, conduct a really successful sale. So a few things just starting off what we're going to talk about tonight. Kind of just some basics, reasons for harvesting, some of the benefits that you would get, and just throwing out a few common mistakes that I've seen over the years and are fairly regular occurrences, unfortunately, and want to help you guys avoid those. Next, we're going to talk about the roles of people involved in a timber sale. There's essentially three parties involved for a successful sale. And then we're going to go through 9 steps for a successful sale. And then at the very end, just go through a brief example on determining your timber basis and maybe saving you some money on federal taxes. So with that, why should you consider cutting trees in your woods? And I'm assuming if you're tuning in tonight, you're either thinking about doing that, or maybe you've done it in the past and it didn't work out so well, or whatever your reason. But a lot of folks that I worked with as a consultant were actually in the MFL program, Managed Forest Law program, and they had required harvest to do. So that's how I kind of came in contact with most of my folks that were interested in doing timber sales. So just for a couple of reasons, we'll go through quick, just obvious ones. And hopefully you can see my cursor okay here. Upper right there, young red pine stand, pretty heavy in stocking, real dense stand. Probably never been thinned, probably 20-year-old stand in that range. Needs to be thinned and helped out. If you're a gardener thinking about, planting a row of carrots, typically you go in there early on in the process and thin a few of the carrots out to make room for the other ones remaining. That produces bigger carrots. In the end, same kind of thing with a forest, helping by taking out some of the runts or suppressed trees. In a pine stand like this, you're actually going to help the residual stand to get more light and nutrients over time. So that's one reason. This lower left picture is a stand of over mature aspen that's beginning, if you look in the bottom here, beginning to kind of fall apart. There's kind of aspen on the forest floor there. Those trees are only probably in that 50-year range. Unfortunately, aspen has a fairly short life cycle. They're one of our early successional species that kind of takes over a stand early on. So those trees have to actually be managed relatively in a short time frame when it comes to trees. White pine, for example, another tree on our woodlots here in Wisconsin might grow to over 200 years and still be going strong. So different ages, different trees, different thinning regimes. And just, when you've got a woodlot, another analogy might be if you're a cattle herder or dairy farm herder, you've got cattle that are getting old, maybe are sick, not producing as well. You kind of cull the herd, same thing in a woodlot. We're removing cankered trees here on the left and right, maybe a mechanically unsound tree that's got a deep fork seam to it that's highly mechanically unsound. So that's a tree you want to remove in a harvest. Poor form trees that multi-stem like this, crooked in nature, never really going to produce some good quality lumber that you might want from a good harvest or a good forest tree. Tree like this on the right, aspen tree that's been nicked, created a lot of rot in the bottom part of that stem. So it's a good tree to remove as well. And maybe you're just favoring some species over the other. Maybe you like to tap maple syrup and want to release these maples from competition to get their crowns bigger so they produce more sap. Or maybe you're at the end of a tree's natural life cycle. Red pines, typically this happens with, or spruce stands. You'll go in and clear cut them when they become mature and then replant them to another younger conifer or hardwood forest. So just some of the reasons you might want to do that. And big picture, there's lots of ways and methods to do this. We're not going to really go into the actual timber stand silviculture part of this whole process, but in the end, we'd all like a woods like this, beautiful woods, nice, strong, tall trees, growing lots of timber, some decent wildlife habit, just a pleasant place to be in. So you're basically creating more space as we're doing this. By removing the poor quality stuff, we're actually increasing the vigor of the ones that get left behind and improving the genetic pool for the long term. So it's, in my mind, it's a good thing correctly. Also, some of the benefits that you think about, income of sorts, of course, from a timber sale, depending on how you do it, you can either maximize that income. Different things you can do with that. We'll talk more about that tonight. Of course, improving wildlife habitat, whether that's for turkeys like you see on the right, they're fond of mast woods, acorn woods, different things you can do to increase oak production, mass production. The aspen woods that we looked at before, great woods to manage for deer and grouse. Cool things you can do with wildlife habitat. Generally, a wildlife habitat biologist, wildlife biologist, their best method of managing wildlife habitat is generally cutting timber and manipulating the timber. So a good tool to use for sure. Enhance recreational opportunities, just different things you can do, open up the woods to maybe create some berries in the understory. The trails, oftentimes after timber harvest, road systems that you put in are excellent trails later on for cross-country skiing or hiking. We'll talk more about those trail systems later in the talk. Improving the aesthetics of the woodlot, just simply by removing maybe some poor quality, kind of ugly looking trees, you're getting a beneficial appearance, I think, with better quality timber remaining. You can do stuff to manipulate the mix of species as well in a sale to kind of increase the diversity, whether it's through fall colors or having more evergreens in the woodlot. So lots of different things you can do. And just one other thing might be manipulating the forest, and specifically a pine stand. Here in Wisconsin, we don't have a lot of issues in other stands, but specifically conifer stands, pine stands, most importantly, where you've got maybe ladder fuels underneath that could fuel a fire. So by removing those smaller trees or stems, you might help reduce the wildlife hazard as well. So just want to go through some mistakes that I've seen over the years. These aren't necessarily by any means all the ones I've seen, and not specifically to each one. Excuse me. But this one's kind of a classic example. Landowner gets doesn't really have a plan in place. Gets an unsolicited call from a logger. Walks, knocks on his door. Said, "Hey, can I give you, $10,000 for your trees?" And landowner, not really knowing the price of the, lumber or woods and trees in his woods, say, sure, that sounds good. Maybe they're in a poor spot financially. Maybe they're laid off due to COVID. So you let the logger mark the trees. Logger gives you, and one, I use loggers as examples of maybe not the best person to contact initially, but I want to make sure that I let you all know that without good loggers, there's no way we could do this. So in no way I am discounting loggers in this equation, but they're like any occupation, there's good ones and bad ones. So we'll talk more about that. But anyway, the landowner signs a simple contract with no real protections. We'll talk about this later. And then doesn't really have any idea what his woods is worth. So in the end, he's left poor quality timber that the logger essentially went in there, took all the good trees, left all the poor quality ones, kind of left a mess, and probably got paid of just a fraction of what those trees were worth. So not a good result in the long run. Number two, this guy actually, this landowner in this example wanted some deer cover. So he had the right idea in mind. You want to harvest aspen, clear cut it before it dies, because it's a short-lived species. But again, he didn't have a plan. He didn't really realize the dynamics behind an aspen harvest. Again, dealt directly with the logger that maybe didn't know the specifics and why you would clear cut the entire stand. So the aspen got cut, but then the smaller maple and balsam got left, kind of in this picture. So what happens is aspen, to regenerate properly, actually needs their soil temp to reach about 72 degrees Fahrenheit, that soil. And by leaving smaller trees kind of scattered about the woodlot, that soil never really gets warm enough to maximize its sprout production. And aspen actually produces root sprouts. That's the way they regenerate. So without that, they never get a full flush of aspen sprouts. So the landowner was like, "Yeah, what happened?" So someone said, "Oh, you gotta, remove everything." But so he goes back and has another logger cut the remaining trees, but then in the process, they trampled whatever young aspen was coming up. And in the end, and this is in a real life example of something that happened to one of my clients, in the end, he had pretty much a stand that was void of much vegetation at all and very little aspen. So kind of a shame when it comes to that. And number three, this is another example of a landowner that I work with, but also a common example throughout forestry and folks owning woodlots. So this pair, dad and his son, wanted to have their pine stand thinned out. Again, no management plan, no real, idea, the whole process and the way they should do it. He did the right thing. He tried to contact a forester, but unfortunately, this guy was a timber buyer working for a lumber company, wasn't a certified forester, didn't know exactly the right way to process a thinning of a pine stand, ended up cutting it too hard. And in the end, the pine, because of the way they grow and their form, after a harvest like this that is cut too hard, they're actually very susceptible to high winds, and you see what happened in the end. So just kind of a mix of three different mistakes that happen, and we'll talk about how to avoid those in the next part of this presentation. So 9 steps to a successful timber sale. The first 2 steps of these we're going to talk more about next week, I think, in the presentations. So the first one, so I won't spend a lot of time with these, I'll kind of buzz through these, but super important in this whole process. And I'm a forester, so I'm kind of biased. I'm a DNR forester now. I was a consultant forester, so I'm a little bit biased in both of these, but always for sure call a DNR forester if you haven't talked to one already. They can give you free, unbiased recommendations. They can set you on the right path. they can set you up for success. It doesn't cost you anything. It's a great tool, great thing to have in your back pocket, and it's a good way to kind of set you off on the right path. So as DNR foresters, we do a variety of things. In my particular job description, I work about 40% helping the county as a county liaison, manage their forest. My other 40 or 45% is fire related. And then whatever the remainder of that 20-15% is working with private landowners like yourself. I also do some state land management. So a variety of things, and different guys do different things. Some guys are strictly private lands. Other guys have a mix like me. So we do a variety of things. And again, I talked about offering assistance. The one thing, I hope you'll get it, for sure, the folks out of Taylor County, I can do walkthroughs, kind of get you started, get an idea what you have in your woodlot, what you should do, and kind of get you going in the right direction. We do a variety of things, whether it's helping you do cost share programs, which I think they're going to talk about next week, do pest disease diagnosis. We can set you up with small or brief management plans, specifically tailored when you're doing cost share, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, our services are limited, especially when it comes to timber sale assistance. So that's where our role ends. We used to do this a full service kind of thing, but I think the division got super busy, especially with the MFL program. And so they've kind of gone in a different direction. So other foresters can help you out. So other foresters, consulting foresters, are able to do things that we can't do. So a couple of the big things that they can do is help you with timber sale assistance and management plan preparation. So those two big things are, I think, the bulk of what they do, and they're also things that we can't do for you. So in a lot of ways, they're going to be the person that really helps you manage your woodlots. We're going to get you started, but they're the ones that are going to help you really kind of carry the ball through to the end zone, so to speak. They can also help you with some tax help. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ways you can save some money in taxes at the end. They can do appraisals if you're looking to sell your land, help you with tree planting. We can help you with tree planting in terms of cost share and plans, but we can't actually do the tree planting. They're able to actually help you do that. Again, cost share programs. And in terms of timber sales, they're pretty much, most of them, I shouldn't say most of them, a lot of them are kind of the all-encompassing services. They'll do everything for you from start to finish. So they're able to implement proper silvicultural systems, so ways to thin your woods, whether it's through a clear cut, selection cut, just to thin your land, or maybe a regeneration cut like a shelter wood that helps you create more seeds in your understory. They're typically very knowledgeable of all the local markets, mill specs, and your loggers that are in your area, so they're a super valuable resource to use. There's essentially three different kinds. We'll go briefly through what each of them are. Cooperating foresters actually sign a contract with the DNR to abide by our standards and implement their services and management in that same way. They charge a fee, and we'll talk about more about that. Industrial foresters also can be cooperating foresters, but they're actually employed by a mill. So oftentimes their services are free, but it's also tied in with a right to purchase the timber for a specific amount. So in the end, their fee is probably tied in with that amount. You don't always get maybe a market price for the timber, but you get a lot of free services involved with that. Independent consulting foresters are like cooperating foresters. They haven't signed that cooperating forester agreement, so they're basically kind of out on your own and not necessarily abiding by all the rules that the DNR has. So this talks about the cooperating forester program. There's a list that you can get on the DNR website. I'm sure they'll talk about that next week. And again, they manage all their lands according to DNR specs. This kind of summarizes the industrial forester. He's going to help you establish the sale. They'll get you a contract. Not usually market price, just because they've got some of their own fees incorporated in that. And then what I found, and this is no knock to all the industrial foresters, but they're so busy with some stuff, they don't always spend a lot of time monitoring your sales. That's one downfall I see. And again, the independent consulting forester that maybe doesn't have a tie with the DNR. And nothing against them, but that's just, you know, they, in my mind, I think it's a little bit of a risk to work with them without kind of have the backing and support of the DNR. So like selecting anybody, whether you're, you know, going to see a specialist for knee surgery, or, you know, you got some electrical issues, or whatever it is that you're soliciting help from, you want to make sure they know a variety of things, whether it's local knowledge. There's all kinds of foresters across the state. I usually recommend someone that's close by that knows more of the local markets, more of the local loggers. You can compare fees with these guys. They charge at different kinds of rates, whether it's per acre or per hour. So that's a little bit complicated. But at any rate, you want to do your research. You can get help on the DNR website again to find some. And essentially, you're selecting one that you feel comfortable with, that's similar to your mindset. So getting a good forester is one of your most important decisions. So spend some time on it and select wisely. Number two is having a management plan written. We talked about that in each one of those examples. The plan essentially goes through your woodlot and kind of frames out what you want to do long-term with your woods. So say you've got a 40-acre parcel and you've got maybe a 10-acre stand of red pine, you've got a 12-acre stand of aspen, you've got a 13-acre stand of northern hardwoods, and maybe the rest an open field. So what a forester will do is go through kind of on the example on the bottom of the page and measure your trees, kind of get a sample snapshot of what you have in your woodlot, kind of get an idea of stocking, what you have for wildlife potential, get kind of a health status of the trees, and kind of get a big picture of what's out there. In turn, he'll use your goals and that kind of thing, whether it's deer hunting or it's aesthetics or recreation or whatever it is. He'll incorporate your goals in with what you have and try to produce a plan that helps you go on the right path in the most efficient way. So we talked a little bit about that. You're collecting all this data, trying to summarize it into a timeline. Usually there'll be a nice map that kind of represents the stands and each one of the areas. This is just kind of a typical timeline, so I'll say in, whatever year you're going to lay out recreational trails, and one year you're going to do a thinning, and then another year maybe, kill all the grapevines or invasive. So kind of a roadmap layout of what you want to do over time. So number three, so hopefully you've got a forester, hopefully you've got a plan in place. And then with that forester, from here on, typically most foresters are going to kind of do the rest of this for you with your help and guidance, incorporating this. You can certainly do some of this throughout, but this is just kind of a good process where a good forester selection can really set you up for success. So the big thing you want to do initially, if you haven't already, excuse me, is establish property boundaries. Property boundaries are a tricky thing, and they're nothing to take lightly. You can get involved with timber trespass and all kinds of cruddy things that could cost you a lot of money. So you want to work, one, with your neighbors if you don't know where the line is. Two, don't always trust an old fence to be the actual line. Those old fences sometimes are remarkably on the money and sometimes remarkably not on the money. So if you've got information to survey information, if your forester does, oftentimes they can put in a pretty good boundary line. If that's not the case, you can get a surveyor involved. Sometimes I've had landowners share survey costs, or at least putting in pipes to determine that line. So you want to really get that boundary line established. You can do a thing called the boundary line agreement that essentially places that line in. It's not a set in stone agreement, but it's essentially exists for the period of the timber sale, and it's a good way to kind of get involved some maybe technical legal issues with that boundary line. Then your forester will clearly mark the timber sale boundary where you're actually going to be doing thinning in your woods. So say you have an 80-acre woods, maybe you're only going to do 30 acres of the sale. He's going to set those boundaries up for the timber sale. And then within those boundaries, he's going to delineate trees that should be marked or left, depending on what you're doing. Sometimes they'll actually mark the leave trees if there's going to be a lot of trees taken out, like in a shelter wood situation. But most of the time they're going to be marking actually the trees that get cut. Sometimes they'll designate trees so they won't even have to mark them, like an aspen or a balsam. So different things to do. We could talk a lot about the whole process of how to manage the woods in terms of marking and different silvicultural methods to actually, regrow and grow the forest, but that would take up most of our time. So we're going to kind of skim over that tonight. Another step involved here, locating the roads, trails, and landings. So another thing the forester can help you with. A lot of woods have kind of trails set up already. Sometimes they're not ideally located. Typically in a woodlot, if you can have a wood or a trail system every 10 chains or so, that's about 1/8 of a mile. It's a good kind of buffer section in between that you can properly manage that and get forestry equipment efficiently in and out. And you can certainly go wider than that. The nice thing about those trail systems that you put in for the logging system, you can actually use those later on, whether it's for cross-country skiing or hiking or hauling firewood or whatever it is. It's a good way to kind of get a double double bang for the buck, essentially. The other thing that you want to really be cognizant of is managing your trails and roads along water. You don't want your roads eroding into water systems or creeks and that kind of thing. So it's a good way to make sure that you have a good plan for that, and installing water dams, culverts, that kind of thing, so you're not affecting water quality at all. And then kind of in what I said before, just considering the size of the equipment and what kind of system you'll need. Step 5, after he's done, or I shouldn't say he or her, your forester, is marking the timber. Usually they'll go back and take sample plots just to determine what volume or value of wood is coming out of the sale. And this is going to vary widely all across the board in terms of markets. We're in the midst of a horrible low end on our pulp market right now. The Verso mill closing down in Rapids really kind of threw our pulp markets for a loop. They were the biggest consumer of pulp products in the state, and with their closing and hopefully temporary closing, it's still up in the air. They've kind of had a cascading effects on other markets, and so it's been tough on loggers right now. If I were a landowner right now, I probably would hold off on marketing my wood just because market prices are pretty low, especially on the pulp end. Log prices are okay. Some species are actually not bad, but typically most sales involve saw logs and pulp products or bolt products. And by determining this kind of volume of your woods, when you do get a bid, and what we'll talk about in a little bit, you'll be able to kind of evaluate that bid and say, hey, I'm not willing to pay or get paid this little for this, for my timber here. So the next step is kind of develop what we call a timber sale prospectus, and this is usually a 1 or 2 page document that gets sent out to all the loggers. It essentially just kind of boils down your woods sale and describes it to loggers. It might not make a ton of sense to you, some of the jargon that gets used, but it makes perfect sense to loggers. It basically tells them where your land's located, the map, what kind of sale we're going to have in there, the bid requirements, if we need a performance bond, when the bid opening might be, all the specifics of what they would need to do in your sale are in there. So it's just a very useful, helpful document to kind of get that sale process going. So there's essentially two ways that we normally sell timber here in Wisconsin. One's a lump sum sale, other one's a scale product sale. These lump sum sales are a little bit more common, I think, down south where there's a little bit more saw log volume, saw timber volume. And what it does is, like the process we used before to determine that value and volume, that gets sent out in a prospectus, but instead of doing the scale sale, which I'll talk about next, the logger just gives a one lump sum amount that he's willing to pay for that timber. And that typically gets paid to the landowner prior to the start of the harvest. So the landowner's got that money in hand, so it's nice in that way. There's some downsides to that. If you don't have a good appraisal done or estimate, and you estimate low volumes on that, you might get a lower amount for your wood than is actually there. But the good thing about lump sum sales too is there's not as much administration side of things, and we'll talk about the administration side of things on the scale sale, which involves a lot more. So there's definitely benefits to doing a lump sum sale. Scale product sale is actually the more common one in this neck of the woods. It's based on predetermined prices before the sale starts, so that bid sale prospectus, the logger will actually submit a bid. And so just an example, if there's 10,000 feet of red oak, the logger will actually say that I'm going to bid or pay 350 per 1,000 board feet for every one of those board foot that gets cut and trucked to the mill. Same thing with hardwood pulp. They'll pay a certain amount based on mill scale when it gets delivered to the mill. So I think it's more popular in that regard because both parties are getting essentially paid or worth the exact amount of volume that gets removed from the wood. So that part of it, I think it's fair, more fair to each party. So, and again, that's more the accepted way to do things around here. The administration, excuse me, of the sale is a lot higher because you're documenting every load of wood that leaves the sale. So it's a little bit more paperwork. Actually, it's a lot more paperwork, so it can get kind of crazy. So mailing out these prospectus, you can often do these different ways. The most common way is the sealed bid sale, where you're sending it out to a broad cast number of loggers that will bid on your sale, and they basically get that prospectus. They have to return the bid, sealed bid, typically by a certain date of what they're willing to pay. Smaller sales, when you've got maybe just a handful of loggers that might be interested in your sale, you can maybe do your forester could maybe do an oral or a negotiated bids between the guys and just see who's willing to cut it and how much they're willing to pay. Or if you've got a logger that you've worked with before, you really like what he does, you're not necessarily overly concerned about price as long as it's fair, you can also do a direct sale. And that's a way that people that have done this before, I think, really go to that method because they just want to, they've got a good logger, they want to stick with them, and in the end, the financial part of that doesn't mean a whole lot because oftentimes they get paid pretty well. So you get all the bids in, you've got a sealed bid sale. Who do you pick? So typically on a sale, you can get anywhere from one to, a handful to popular sales where you get 7 or 8 or 9 bids on a sale. So who do you pick? Do you pick the guy that's going to pay you the most? Well, not necessarily. Lots of guys in the area, and sometimes you don't maybe know who's the best, who does the greatest work. So your high bidder might be a guy that you haven't worked with before, maybe doesn't have a great reputation when you check his references. Typically, you go with the high bid, 95 times out of 100. But in my life as a consultant forester, we didn't always go with the high bid. Unfortunately, it makes the high bidder a little upset when that happens. He's, put the effort into putting some money out there, but that's not always the case. So typically there's a clause in the timber sales prospectus that you can not always take the high bid. So that's not always a sure thing. So selecting your logger is a lot like selecting your forester or your doctor or your plumber, whoever you're working with. You typically want to look at experience. You want to get references. The thing that I like to do with guys that I haven't worked with or loggers that I haven't worked with is just ask them if they could send me a list of their recent sales. I think that's the best way to do it. You see their work, see what they've done, see how they've treated the land. So in the end, my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully that doesn't last for long. You hear me okay still, Bill?
Yes.
Okay, good. And insurance, and most good loggers are going to have insurance. In fact, all of them should have good insurance, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. So what do you look for in a logger? Talk to other landowners that have maybe worked with the guy. If you want to talk to him beforehand, just see what his communication style is. Again, visit the harvest sites, and maybe talk to some of his clients and kind of get an idea of what they've done and how they kind of do their business. Lots of different training that they can go under. Master Logger certification is a great group that kind of keeps those loggers to higher standards. They do checks on them periodically. If you were to pick a master logger, typically you're going to have a real solid logger, doing your work. They're also involved with different organizations, whether it's FISTA, which is a training group that they most guys have to be doing some continuing education with. GLTPA, another good group, and SFI is one of these groups that do just the sustainable certification forestry. That's another good stamp to have on your resume. Other things to look at too, not just particularly, what they do, their experience, but what kind of equipment they have. If a guy's set up for mainly just doing clear cuts and he's got equipment that are more efficient to do that, that might not be a good way to do. Maybe if you've got a small pine thinning or a hardwood thinning, and vice versa. So the guy that maybe you've got 30 acres of aspen clear cut, and the guy's set up for a smaller operation, he's probably not going to be able to pay as much for that wood. So different ways to skin the cat. Again, insurance, for sure they should have quality workman's comp and liability coverage. One accident on your sale with a logger that doesn't have good insurance will end up, you'll be the loser in the end on a sale that you're going to make, whatever, $20, $30, $40,000 on. That money will be gone in a flash. So always make sure that they've got insurance, and a good forester will make sure that happens as well. And again, reminder, foresters are going to help you through this whole process. So another good thing to do if you haven't worked with a logger is just do a little quick background check that can eliminate a bad apple in a hurry just by going through there and making sure that they've got a clean history in terms of lawsuits and that kind of thing. So once you've selected your logger, last thing specifically you want to do, and super importantly, is to get a good timber sale contract. You don't want to use a one-page contract that says I'll cut this timber and pay you this much, and there's no ending date. So a good contract has pages and pages of information about when the sale is going to be, the time frame, how much you're going to get paid, when you're going to get paid, how they're going to do it, what happens if there's damage to your woods, the whole, basically anything you can think of that might happen or happen in a sale is covered in that in a good contract. It actually helps protect both parties. So just kind of going through some of the things that I mentioned already, really kind of summarizes everything that you want in a sale, and again protects both you and the logger. So it's a must. You have to have a good contract in place. So sale's about to start. So typically you want to meet with your forester and the logger, kind of go through the sale prospectus, kind of the contract specs, just to make sure you're all on the same page. That cooperation communication is huge. You can avoid small things turning into big things by that way. So it's super important, that initial visit and kind of get together. Plus it allows you to, if you haven't met them prior, it kind of gives a personal twist to it, and they know that they're cutting in somebody's woods. So I think it helps them, both parties, emotionally, to kind of be connected. Once the sale goes on, the owner and the forester should be visiting the sale often. A bigger sale with lots of crews in there should be obviously visited more often. There's more wood, more things that can go wrong in a given day. A big crew might be cutting, 100 cords a day or more, depending on the equipment they have in there. A smaller one-person operator might be only cutting 10 cords a day. So it all depends on who you've got in there and how often you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping an eye on things. And then also kind of getting that ticket box system, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Other big thing that you always want to remember, and this is from, it's a state statute, you want to make sure that you file a county cutting notice, and you basically just filing one of those with your county clerk. You want to make sure you do that before the process starts. You can do it, the forester can do it, the logger can do it. Typically that gets spelled out in the contract that you have with the logger, and it's just a good reminder to make sure that gets done. Heavy fines if you don't. And it's typically a fairly simple form, just the date, where you're doing it, what you're logging, all your name information, and that's it. So it's a fairly simple process, easy to do, and one thing you should make sure you do. Historically, these were done to basically protect the counties from people cutting wood that maybe were tax delinquent, that kind of thing. So it really is trying to protect the counties from, I think originally was back in the lumber baron days when people would buy properties and liquidate them and not pay the taxes. So I think that's where it originally came up with. So what are you going to do when you monitor the sale? So you got a good forester, or if you're trying to help them, you're looking for a lot of different things. You're looking for erosion control measures. You don't want the woods all rutted up like this in spots. You don't want residual timber getting nicked up. These are your trees that you're trying to keep. You certainly don't want them nicked up for the future. So that's something you always want to try to avoid. This is something that always catches my eye, this skinned up, and that's basically from a skidder going past and rubbing its wheel against the base of that tree and ripping off the bark, and that open area becomes an infection core for rot and that kind of thing. So it's something you really want to avoid. Making sure you've got proper stump heights, making sure the slash gets knocked down, a condition of residual trees. Are the right trees getting cut? Are they cutting unmarked trees? The rutting. And then utilization is another big one that you really have to keep an eye on, making sure that they're utilizing the wood like they should be, making sure that you're getting the most out of the timber that's getting cut. This is the ticket box system that I talked about. Essentially what this does is, on a scale sale, it allows your forester or you to track the wood that's leaving the property. So each one of these hauls or loads that gets hauled out, this ticket is filled out and put in this ticket box, which is on the sales site, and it basically helps you to track what wood is moving in and out. The logger has to fill out all the information on here, the date haul, the destination, and so on. So once you get that ticket, you can keep that hold of that, and then when that wood gets scaled at the mill, you have a corresponding ticket that you can match that with the date and time, and this, you probably can't see this great, but it'll actually give you the scale slip, gives you the amount of wood that actually was trucked. So that's how you get paid. So if you remember my example, and this is actually a balsam fir load, I think. Say the logger was going to pay you $14 a ton, so you'd get paid 30.1 times whatever the logger agreed to pay you. Same thing with log scale. If he paid you, if he was paying you 3,500 to 1,000 feet, you could get paid accordingly with that. So that's kind of how the scale system works. So the sale's all done. You want to make sure you're finalizing all those tickets, making sure you're all set with the hauling, that kind of thing, making sure everything lines up, payments, that kind of thing. Winter sales, you often want to let that road system, if there's any question, let that kind of go through that spring thawing cycle so you can make sure that's in good shape. If you're in the MFO program, always want to make sure that you're reporting those final volumes to your MFL specialist. And again, your forester can help you with that. And in some respects, do a post-harvest cruise just kind of to see what that residual stocking ended up, so you can kind of plan for the future as well. Just a quick example about federal income tax considerations. You always want to treat your wood proceeds as a long-term capital gain, and I forgot the long-term part of that. That's actually the first typo I noticed, so that's not too bad. There's probably been more, but I haven't noticed them. But essentially, you want to make sure that you're paying that. Typically, your regular income rates are going to be higher than that, depending on your income bracket. Most people are going to be in that 15% bracket. So it's usually, most folks are in that 20% bracket. So you're going to save some money with that. The thing that you have to do, though, to determine that is figure out your basis. And that is a process that the forester will go through and take sample plots and kind of figure out the estimated dollars per acre that your timber was worth when it was purchased. So just kind of a analogy that's, I think, a little bit easier to understand is, say you purchase a stock for $10, and then 6 years later you sell that stock for 15. You're not going to get taxed on that $15 amount. You're going to get taxed on that $5 gain. So it's just the way they do it. And I kind of rolled through and gave another example, timber related. So your timber value or basis was 100,000 in 1990. Value of timber was in 2020 was $150,000. So that increase in the timber value is 50,000. So if you, and this is the example, if you're clear cutting, liquidating every stick of timber, which you normally wouldn't do, and there's a different kind of formula to treat that. It's basically a percentage, but instead of paying taxes on that $150,000, you're paying taxes just on that 50. So good thing to think about. It's not always, there's costs involved to determine that basis by the forester. So typically I don't have folks do it that have a smaller woodlot. When you're talking 80-acre woodlot, then it's probably a good investment to make. And it's a little bit harder to do that after the VAC. So say you bought the land in 2000, if you try to do that timber basis now, it would be pretty hard to redo that and regrow, figure out what those trees were worth at that time. So sooner you buy the land, sooner you acquire it, the better you want to, or the sooner you want to do it for figuring out your basis. Just makes it a lot easier. So that's about it. I'm not sure even how I did for time. Oh, I'm pretty good. So we kind of went through the reasons for harvesting, some of the benefits, some of the mistakes. And so the roles of those people involved, we talked quite a bit about you, the owner, getting that plan developed, selecting the good forester, and then that forester helping you get a good logger. So if I could boil down this talk into like 15 seconds, it would be that. Get a management plan, get a good forester, and have them get you a good logger. And in the end, that'll be, most of the battle. So we talked about the 9 steps, and then we just did that brief overview on federal tax implications. And in the end, if you're felling trees, always use the neighbor's truck. So with that, are there any questions?
Yeah, I just want to remind folks to submit your questions in the chat for Jeff. I got one right away, a couple for you right away, Jeff. You mentioned that most of the time you'll be accepting the highest bid for your timber. What would be the circumstances where you wouldn't accept the highest bid?
Yeah, so, and it doesn't happen often, but so say you've got a sale where you get 5 bids. The high bid is, not substantially, but slightly higher, say a couple $1,000s more on say a $30,000 sale. So the money isn't substantial, but say the highest bidder is a guy that you never worked with before. Maybe your forester hasn't worked with them, and maybe in checking out references in the area, you get kind of mixed results. And then say the number 2 guy is a guy that you're knowledgeable of, maybe you've worked with him or knew about him, and he's got a much better reputation. So in the end, you might decide to go with that number 2 guy that came in second place. the guy that came in first probably isn't going to be super happy. But if you justify going with that number 2 guy and explaining why you did, in the end, it's, you know, about protecting yourself and going with the best logger for your job. And so that's why I would do it. I don't do it a lot, but I've done it a handful of times with my clients back when I was a consultant forester.
And could you talk a little bit about why the bids might be different? What goes into the logger figuring out what they're willing to pay for the trees that you have?
Sure. It's a super complicated process. You know, markets fluctuate like anything, stock market, same thing with timber. Supply and demand, different pressures on these markets, that Verso mill closing that I talked about, international markets, the Asian market is a big influencer. COVID, you know, just with the job market, housing starts, there's all kinds of different factors that influence what buyers can pay. And there's all kinds of different buyers out there. There's industrial foresters that maybe focus on pulp, and maybe not so much on saw timber. There might be a sawmill that builds on your land that's more interested in the saw logs and not so much the pulp. There might be a general logger that has different markets for different things. So all those guys that are bidding on your land have different markets that they use. Maybe their equipment is more efficient, so they're able to cut more wood. Maybe it's just a hand crew, so they're not, you know, as fast. So lots of different variables. So you're gonna, on a lot of sales, if you've got generally equal crews and producers, they're remarkably similar in their bids just because their markets are often the same. But you can also get wildly different bids, you know, from huge percentages, 3 times the worth. So that's why you really want to do the sealed bid, kind of broad net cast, to get what the market bears, because in the end, your timber is worth what other people are willing to pay for it. So that's kind of why there are those different fluctuations.
So often I'll get asked, what's oak going for now these days in certain counties? So how do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Again, kind of backing up to my previous answer, different communities, mills have different influences on what they're willing to pay for oak. Maybe there's more oak in a particular county, so the supply is more, so they don't necessarily have to pay as much. Maybe they're in a county with not as much oak, and they've suddenly got a contract for one of their clients that needs more oak. So lots of different factors, you know, locally that affect what mills can pay. Price of oak, even among the counties here in Wisconsin, varies all across the board. And it really kind of boils down to, again, what those individual either mills or loggers are willing to pay for a particular product at a particular time. So it's lots of different variables that affect those prices.
Yeah, I wish we could point people to a list that give prices that are good wherever they are in the state, but there really isn't something like that, is there?
Yeah, well, you know, they can actually access state sale information on the DNR website. Different counties actually will list what they're getting paid for their timber sales. There's actually different private systems that I actually used to, as a consultant, used to subscribe to. And then there's actually the state MFL stumpage tax rate that you can kind of get a general idea, but that oftentimes varies wildly as well. So like I said, in the end, your timber is worth whatever loggers are willing to pay for it at that particular time. So, and then, you know, there's all kinds of variables for them as well. Cost of labor, cost of fuel, equipment repairs, you know, the whole 9 yards, and whatever business you might be in are all the same for loggers as well.
And Lauren has posted in the chat that County Timber Sale website. I'll include that in the email I send tomorrow with the link as well.
One thing I forgot to mention, Bill,
go ahead.
The Wisconsin woodland owners, and I'm imagining if you could send that link out. I know in the past they had a sample timber sale contract that you could use. So that's a really good resource. That's actually what I use as a consultant, and I just had a lawyer modify it for my purposes, and I generally use that with all my clients, and it really worked out well. I'd never had an instance where we got sued over it or any kind of worries with the implications of the contract or how it read out. So that's a good resource.
Excellent. Yes, well, we'll include that in the chat. So someone had put a note into the chat stating that inherited wood lot value will be the fair market value at time of death or when you inherit the property. Could you use that as a start of the basis? Your basis?
I believe so, but I'm not an accountant and don't pretend to be one. So that I believe that's correct, but I would always make sure that you verify that with your accountant.
My experience has been there's not a lot of accountants out there that know what to do with woodland owners.
There's actually, and I'm blanking on his name now. Maybe Justin knows. I think it's Burns, if I'm remembering correctly. There's one guy in the state that handles a lot of timber tax stuff. That's kind of the guru. And if I think of
Gary
that,
Searfoss?
That's another one. Yeah, he's a great one. And different consultants do more tax work than others. I did a fair amount of timber basis over the years for my bigger clients, just because it was worth it for them to do that and saved them some money that way. But I didn't do it a lot. I probably have only done 5 or 6 timber bases in my years as a consultant. The more land you have, the bigger return you'll get on it.
And Jake, who sent that note about the inherited value, just sent his credentials. He's a senior IRS agent, so we believe you, Jake. Thanks for clarifying that. That's a good note. I was wondered about that, if that's a good starting point. So if you do inherit it, and that's a good way to set your basis right there.
Yeah, you reestablish that basis at that amount. So that is correct. So I guess right.
So, and I just got another question about pulpwood prices since the mill closed in Rapids. Has it been like a precipitous drop in pulp prices?
Yes, in a lot of ways. In some ways, not so much than others. Specifically for that mill is a hardwood mill. Aspen prices haven't dropped as much, although even with that, they've dropped some. If I was an owner of woodlot and looking to do a timber sale, you certainly want to get it set up and get ready to sale. But I'm not exactly sure that I would even put wood up for sale right now. The market is so volatile and there's so many unknowns that loggers just have very limited markets that they can even bring their wood to, and the prices, of course, lower just because of the whole supply demand issue. So it's a tricky time, really a tricky time for the whole timber industry. So I would be hesitant about doing that. Of course, if you've got, red pine or something that's not really related to the hardwood market, those prices really haven't, at least what I've seen, really taken a change. Spruce, that kind of thing. But if you've got a fair amount of hardwood, pulp in particular, on your potential sale, I think I would just sit tight, certainly get it set up, but maybe sit tight for another year or 6 months.
That was my next question. How long should folks wait? You said 6 months to a year. Is anything longer? Or is that about right?
No, and it's hard to tell. You never know how things will turn, and if they do hopefully get that mill purchased by another group, things might turn around in a hurry. But at the same time, we're losing loggers because of this, and so it's really going to have, in some ways, a good effect in terms of cutting the amount of supply that gets brought to the mill. So a lot of variables in there, but I think I would really hold off for at least 6 months and maybe watch the news and see how things are going in regards.
Hey Jeff, can I make a comment on that too?
Sure, absolutely.
So I would consider calling the logger or the forester now just to get an idea of what's in your woods. It's better to start the process early.
Absolutely.
Most loggers buy their wood a year in advance at minimum. So it's good to get on their radar so they're on the list. That way, 6 months down the road, the prices go up. You're not starting the process at that point. You're already in the process so that they can prices go up, then they can move right in and get going. So it's important to start the process early, but maybe not complete the process.
Yeah, exactly, Justin. And like I said, certainly get the process rolling, get a forester. Some of the foresters, even consulting foresters, are even kind of holding off on doing stuff right now because a lot of them get paid as the timber gets cut. So it's tough on them too. But certainly, get the ball rolling, and that way you'll be ready to jump on things when it does bounce back.
John posted that a place to get prices for timber in Wisconsin is the Forest Data Network. Have you ever heard of that?
I haven't heard of that. There's lots out there, but that's certainly if there's, they pop up and go away, and so that might be a good one. Some of those places though use public data that's already out there. So in terms of a subscription to that kind of thing, I wouldn't pay a lot for one because a lot of that data, sometimes they just use public data and kind of regurgitate and reformulate it into their own, which sometimes isn't super valuable.
Well, that's all the questions we have. Thanks, Jeff. Great presentation.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. And again, if you're in Taylor County, don't hesitate to email me or call me at that information below. And I'm going to be super busy the next few months. I've got some training, got some county land that I have to mark in March, and then fire season will be hot and heavy in April and May. But come this summer, I'll have a lot more time to be able to do walkthroughs and meet up with y'all. So just give me an email or give me a shout out, and we'll get something on the calendar for the summer.
And for those folks in Clark County, next week, Justin, your forester there, Justin Kapusta, will be talking about assistance in planning. So thanks everyone for sitting in, and we'll see you next week.